Hello again, and welcome to lecture number 8 in our series on the foundations of Western civilization. The last time we talked about the Greek Dark Ages and the Greek Archaic period, and perhaps you'll recall my saying that during the Archaic period, or during the period from about 800 to about 700 BC, the first faint stirrings of the Greek polis, the classic Greek political institution, are visible. In today's lecture, we're going to talk in particular about Sparta. In the next lecture, we will talk in some detail about Athens. So what we're going to try to do is understand the classical Greek polis. The plural of that word, by the way, is polis, not polises. We're going to try to understand the polis as a political, as a social, and as a cultural entity. Today, and in this lecture, and in the next one, we'll speak in particular about the polis of Sparta and then Athens as political and social entities, and we'll then turn in a series of lectures to the polis as a cultural phenomenon. Now, a few very preliminary considerations may help us to sort of enter on this discussion of a polis and what a polis is and what it represents. First of all, for example, physical characteristics. What exactly was a polis? We may think, well, it's a city. That goes without saying. That's self-evident. But it's not quite so simple. We can express what a polis was by means of a formula. We can say asti plus kora equals polis. Now, what that means is this. Asti is the Greek word for city proper, and it actually refers to the urban core, the urban center of the polis. Kora is a Greek word that means region or district. What this refers to is the agricultural hinterland that surrounded a polis. So a polis is always an urban core, asti, and a rural hinterland, kora. So for instance, in Athens, you have Athens plus Attica makes the Athenian polis. In Sparta, you have Sparta and Laconia, which makes the Spartan polis. So we always have to bear in mind that there are these two elements and that they have a very important symbiotic relationship. Now, inside the urban area itself, the polis of the Greek world had certain features in common. There would be great variation, but there were certain features in common. An agora. Think of agoraphobia, the fear of public places. Well, an agora in a Greek city, in a Greek polis, was the marketplace. An open market that was, yes, where products were exchanged, people bought things, people sold things, but also where people encountered one another, where they talked to one another, where they shared gossip with one another. In a sense, the life of the polis was really played out informally, in many ways, in the agora. There would almost always be temples. Temples dedicated in the first place to the god or goddess to whom that city was most particularly dedicated, and then for other cults that were important to the people in that place. There would also be either a building or a public area, could be either one, where the public life of the polis was played out in more formal senses. This is where assemblies met, where legislative institutions met, perhaps where courts of law met. In other words, different from the agora, where informally the public life of the city was played out, the institutional center was where formally the life of the polis was played out. And there were also then entertainment facilities. Generally, these were of two kinds: theaters. Many of the surviving Greek polis will show us the remains, sometimes, as for example in Athens or in one or two other places, very impressive remains of the ancient theater, and then sometimes also stadiums. You may recall our saying last time that the Greeks were very much very enamored of competition, and that started with athletic competition that began with the Olympic Games and then eventually extended itself to games played in many Greek cities. So not surprisingly, many of the Greek polis had stadiums. Some polis also had natural fortifications. Now these could involve, for example, walls around the city, but often there was a high point. Cities very often were built around or even on a high point. In Athens, for example, we have the Acropolis. Now this is a stone butte that sticks up right in the middle of the city, several hundred feet above the level of most of the urban core down below it. And this was a place where, for example, temples and important buildings could be built so that people would go there in ritual procession, but it was also a place to which people could retreat if the city were ever attacked by any of its neighbors. Not every city had an acropolis. Athens doesn't have the only acropolis. We always think of the famous Athenian acropolis, but there were in fact acropoles in a number of Greek cities. Corinth had one, for instance. So usually there was also some provision provided for defending the polis. Aristotle, who wrote a great deal about Greek government, we'll have occasion in some later lectures to talk in much more detail about Aristotle. Aristotle believed that people naturally lived in polis, by nature. We associate with one another. You may have heard the old statement, Aristotle said, man is a political animal. Well, in point of fact, that's not quite what Aristotle said. What Aristotle said is, man is by nature a creature who lives in a polis. Now, of course, what you do in a polis is politike, is in a sense politics. But that really means city-ix. But we don't quite have that word. I mean, I need it right now, but I don't have it. All right? So politics, you see, is what you do in a city. And that's what Aristotle said is natural to us. We come together in communities and we regulate our affairs. Now, Aristotle was very much interested, as a philosopher might well be, in the fact that over the Greek world there were a large number of these polis. We know something, historically, about nearly 200 of them. Aristotle and a number of his pupils, he was kind of running like a research institution, studied the constitutions of more than 100 of these polis. Aristotle reserved it to himself to study the constitution of Athens. And in some later lectures we'll have occasion once in a while to draw on some of Aristotle's observations about Athens. So he studied Athens. He had his pupils sort of write theses, we might almost say, about a large number of the other Greek polis, because Aristotle was very interested in discerning what was common, what was different, were there any underlying, any fundamental principles, you see. Alas, all of these other works have vanished. We have, thankfully, Aristotle's treatment of the Athenian constitution, but all of these other studies of the other Greek polis have vanished. So we know a little from other sources, from histories and chance references in plays and all sorts of things. We know a little something about these other cities, and we know that the variation could be considerable from one city to another. They were by no means alike, all right? If we were really interested in the polis, and if we really wanted to explore that subject in great detail, we'd have to assemble everything we've been able to learn about all of these polis and compare them and contrast them in all sorts of ways. We don't have time to do that here. What we're going to do instead is focus on the two most famous, and in many ways the two most distinctive, of the Greek polis. Sparta, in the first place, and we'll turn to that in more detail in just a second, and Athens, to which we'll turn in our next lecture. But I don't want to leave the impression that all Greek cities were either like Sparta or like Athens. That's not true. Sparta's earliest development is shrouded in legend. Now, by now, that's not going to surprise us. The origins of everything, it seems, are shrouded in legend. The Spartans told a story. Supposedly, a mythical lawgiver by the name of Lycurgus, on the command of the gods, gave Sparta a constitution all at once in about the year 750 BC. Well, there's several things wrong with that. First of all, for instance, we do think Lycurgus is a real historical person. We do think there was such a person at Sparta, and that he may very well have been an important reformer. He may very well have played a significant role in the elaboration of the Spartan system. But it's also clear, it seems, that the Spartan system emerged over a long period of time and slowly, and probably, in fact, reached its culmination at about the time when the Spartans conquered the Messenians. Perhaps you'll recall, in the last lecture, we had said that the pressures of the early archaic period, or this transitional period, could be met in the Greek world in various ways. You could colonize and export your population, for instance. You could engage in trade, or you could conquer additional land. And the Spartans in particular chose that option. They conquered their neighbors to the west, the Messenians. So it seems that some aspects of the Spartan system, however old they might have been, however many sort of embryonic features they may have contained, were really sharpened, were hardened after the conquest of the Messenians. Okay? Now, that takes place in the 8th century BC, so the tradition remembering that somewhere in the 8th century BC the Constitution was made is not bad. Remember, we talked about how close Greek tradition on the date of the Trojan Wars is. We talked about handing things down orally over long periods of time. Traditions are not false because they're traditions, and legends often have much in them that is true. It's sorting out what is true and what is false in terms of facts that is tricky. But when we discuss myth, when we discuss legend, if we are seeking only those few kernels of truth, we're going to miss the whole point. Because myth and legend are meant to tell stories that tell much larger truths than the tiny and humble facts which they contain. What the Spartans thought then about their past was that a great lawgiver had given them their system at once. Now that's worth pausing to think about for just a minute, because in that regard, the Spartans are not unlike a lot of other peoples. The Athenians, for example, also thought their laws were given to them by a person called Theseus. Now, they never quite, the Athenians didn't, associate their whole system with Theseus, the way the Spartans did with Lycurgus. But we might think about Moses, to whom the law is attributed. And yet, clearly, the law evolved over a long period of time. Much later, the Romans remembered a figure called Numa Pompilius as having given them their law. There is a tendency always to imagine a founding father, not a founding mother, and that is interesting as well, to imagine a founding father, or perhaps founding fathers. Think how frequently we Americans speak of the founding fathers, and how much legend and myth has attached to what they did, you see? And sometimes we're interested in the facts, and sometimes we're interested in sort of the larger story, the big picture. Well, the Spartan system, then, is revealed to us by a number of ancient writings. We actually have quite a lot of source material. We don't have Aristotle's Constitution of Sparta, but we have a lot of writings about Sparta, and we know a lot about the system. It was in many ways quite a peculiar system. We might very well think, in the modern world, that a particularly successful political system is one that is designed to accommodate change. In other words, one that can incorporate contention, institutionalize contention, diffuse contention, and move forward. The Spartan system, on the other hand, was designed not to accommodate, but to prevent change. This was one of the most conservative political systems created in human history, and created such by design, and not at all by accident. Now, the first feature of the Spartan system that we want to think about as we proceed along to try to understand it as a political system and as a social system, because these two systems complement one another in important ways. The first feature then that we want to talk about are the social classes at Sparta. Who were these Spartans? The first and the most important class of people at Sparta were called the homoioi. That means the equals. The equals. All adult Spartans who were male. Adult meant above the age of 18. If you were 18 and a Spartan and male, you were an equal. Now, these people had very wide opportunities for participation in the Spartan system. They had substantial rights of political involvement, of political speech, of voting on key issues. This is interesting and important to us. However conservative, however traditional, however stodgy the Spartan system was, it accorded earlier a wider degree of political organization, at least within the equals, than virtually any other political system had done before this time. One could actually ask, was Sparta in some sense democratic? One could say that Sparta was a quasi-democracy, at least among the equals. Whether or not Sparta was democratic is something that may come into a little bit sharper focus for us in our next lecture when we're talking about Athens, and we can perhaps develop one or two comparative insights on the two cities. So the equals first. Second, a group of people called the perioikoi. The perioikoi. An oikos is a house in Greek. Peri means around. These were the people around the house. Well, not actually around your house or anybody else's house. It meant the dwellers about. We would say resident aliens. Resident aliens. There's a good deal of scholarly controversy over who exactly we are to understand by these resident aliens. I won't go into great detail on this. Some have suggested that they may have been the indigenous population of Laconia who were there when the Dorians came. Remember our Dorian invasions round about the 12th century BC. Some have suggested they may have been people who migrated into Laconia from surrounding regions. Some have suggested they may have been people who fell out in political contention in Sparta in earlier times. It's very hard to say. They were people who lived in Sparta, who were protected by the Spartan system, who had certain rights, who had certain opportunities, but they could never be Spartan citizens, and therefore they could never participate politically in the Spartan state. Finally, very interesting class of people, the Helots. The Helots were state slaves. Essentially, these were the conquered Mycenaeans, those neighbors to the west of Sparta whom the Spartans conquered as a way of sort of relieving the demographic pressures in their own area. Now, what is very distinctive about the Helots is that they did not belong to individual Spartans. They belonged to Sparta. Slavery is an old institution, but in most places, slaves belong to individuals, as individuals. In Sparta, the Helots, in a sense, as a corporate body, belonged to Sparta as a corporate body. And it is clear, it seems, that some aspects of the Spartan system were really designed to keep those Helots in place. Okay? Now, if we turn then from the main social classes at Sparta to the institutions of the Spartan system, how was the place set up? How did it operate? There were, in the first place, two kings. Not one, two. Very interesting. The idea being that one was a check on the other. Now, over a very long period of time, these kings always came from two families. Son succeeding to father, generally speaking. Occasionally, again, brothers and others entered into the line of succession, but kings drawn from two families. One was usually at home, functioning as, in some sense, the chief executive officer of the Spartan state, and one was generally in the field with the Spartan armies. They didn't send out both kings with armies, and usually they weren't both at home. Very interesting that these kings had an absolute veto over each other. If one of them decided to make a decision, the other king could veto it. There were two deliberative councils at Sparta. Now, was this the origins, in a sense, of bicameral legislatures? Well, in a way. But it's very important to understand what these two deliberative bodies at Sparta were like and how they worked in conjunction with each other. The assembly at Sparta was an assembly of direct participation, we might have said direct democracy, by all the equals. If you were an equal, you were a member of the assembly. You weren't elected, you didn't represent anybody, you didn't represent a territory. As an equal, you belonged. The assembly could propose laws. It could propose going to war. It could propose concluding a war. It could propose striking a treaty with someone. But it could not finally legislate by itself. What it could do, in a sense, was set an agenda. That agenda was then, in a sense, forwarded on to the council. The council is really the body that guarded the Spartan system, that really made it work. The council consisted of the kings, the two kings, 5 ephors. Now, I'll come back to these ephors in just a second. Judicial officers, basically. And then all equals above the age of 60. All equals above the age of 60. Now, that's very important, and I want to explain that. But a question may have come up in your mind right now, and it is, this is the ancient world. This is a long time ago. Who in the world was 60? Good question. Figuring life expectancy as an average of the ages at death of all those persons who belong to a society will give you one number, which starts in antiquity, for example, as a fairly low number, probably in the high 20s, and as we come forward in time, gradually moves. For example, in the United States, it moves to a fairly high number. In some parts of the undeveloped world today, it remains a depressingly low number. But if you reckon life expectancy at certain moments in the lifespan, the numbers change pretty dramatically. If you lived to be 20 and you were male, your expectation of life was very long. It was easy to live, well, easy, that's an exaggeration. It was likely, it was possible to live well into your 60s. If a woman lived to be 30 or into her early 30s, she was very likely to live a long time. Childbirth was the great killer of women in the pre-modern world. The point is, of course, that enormous numbers of babies and adolescents died. These were societies which could not solve all of the problems that occur at the moment of birth and all of the problems associated with the diseases of youth and adolescence. That's where large numbers of people died. So if you had, a large number of people who died at 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 50, and you average it up, you get a small number, you see? If you put all of the ones in one category and then think about the people in the other category, you get a very different number. So it's not so shocking that there were lots of men at Sparta above the age of 60 to operate in the council. Now, back to Spartan politics. All the equals could propose things to a body made up of the kings, the ephors, and the equals over 60. They finally said yes or no. Now, they didn't really have the initiative in the legislative process. All right? That did come from the assembly of all the Spartans. But they could stop things they didn't want. They could stop things they didn't want. That was their great power. All right? Now, once you had been a member of the Spartan system to the age of 60, you were not likely to go off on tangents. You were not likely to have a lot of new ideas. You were not likely to entertain happily new ideas. Now, I mentioned ephors a moment ago. Who were these ephors? There were 5 of them. The word basically means overseers, inspectors in a certain sense. Their job was to assure that any law passed by the council or any verdict passed by an Athenian law court was in conformity with the laws of Sparta. So here was yet another break on the system. Here was another check on innovation. There was also the crypteia. The crypteia. Think of the word crypt. You see, secret. A crypt is a secret place. Cryptography is secret writing, for example. The crypteia was the Spartan secret police. These were generally young men, usually between about the ages of 18 and 20, whose job it was to sort of go around and in the first place, keep an eye on the helots. But in the second place, to snoop on ordinary Spartans, and just to make sure that they were behaving themselves. That then was the basic Spartan constitution. Now, it depended on a very curious, very interesting, a very rigid social system, which we call the agage. Now, the agage means the upbringing, the training, the leading along, all right? So this is the social system, the agage, that generated the political system of which we've just been speaking. Babies were inspected at birth, and healthy ones were returned to their parents to about the age of 7. This occasions a pause. The idea of exposing babies at birth, the idea of infanticide. Now, there are lots of famous instances in antiquity. You may think just for a moment of the play Oedipus Rex. Remember, Oedipus is displayed at a crossroads and left there. He's found, and the story goes on. In antiquity, exposing a baby was not actually infanticide. Babies, if you stop and think of the familiar images from literature, they were exposed in market squares. They were put on the doorsteps of temples. They were put on the steps of temples. They were put at crossroads. They were expected to be found. Oedipus was found. He was raised. He lived to a ripe old age until various other things sort of intervened in his life. So, exposing babies in antiquity is certainly not a practice I would want to recommend, certainly not one that we would wish to praise, but it was not the same thing as killing unwanted children. All right, so babies were inspected, and if they seemed healthy, they were returned to their parents until the age of 7. At the age of 7, boys were enrolled in military brotherhoods, to which they belonged for the rest of their lives. In a sense, you were sort of put in a military unit, and you now were a member of that unit for the rest of your life. From 7 to 18, they underwent rigorous physical and military training. Then, as I mentioned a moment ago, from 18 to 20, many of them, not all, but many of them served at least a brief period of time in the Secret Service. They then entered a regular Army unit and remained a member of that unit to the age of 60. Now, there were exceptions made if a person were wounded, if a person were physically impaired as life went along. But you could, in principle, have to serve actively in the field to the age of 60. Marriage at Sparta was not companionate. It was not co-residential. That is to say, husbands and wives, generally speaking, didn't live together. Men lived with their military units. Marriage at Sparta had one fundamental purpose: to make more equals. That was the purpose of marriage at Sparta. And that means, of course, that the institution didn't generate family ties, family loyalties, bonds of family affection, and so on, as we might expect to see in other societies. The Spartans lived very simply. Men lived in barracks, basically. They ate very simple food. They prided themselves on their simplicity. They prided themselves on not being gabby and talking too much. Their land is called Laconia. What does laconic mean? It means you don't have much to say. It means you don't have much to say. And in much Greek literature, there are wonderful stories about Spartans who didn't have much to say. The Spartans didn't like book learning. Now, there's a very interesting point here, a notion that recurs quite a number of times in Western civilization, amongst other peoples and in other places. There was a notion that book learning made men effeminate. It weakened them. It softened them. Now, there is a wonderful irony there, because if it was thought to be the case that book learning made men effeminate, that sort of implies, doesn't it, that lots of women read a lot of books, and then somehow that this was a characteristic of females? And yet, in most of these societies, women were actually denied opportunities to acquire a lot of book learning. Prejudices get built in very, very funny ways and then operate in very funny ways. But there is the notion, remember we talked about the struggle between brains and brawn? That if you got too much brains, you don't have enough brawn. And at Sparta, you want brawn. So, enough with the brain stuff. Spartans used iron money in big bars of small denomination. The whole point of this was to avoid hoarding, to avoid accumulating. What do you want money for? Now, the Spartan system, as I've suggested a couple of times, was designed fundamentally to hold the helots in check. Now, without the labor of the helots, the Spartan system simply would not have worked. How would all of these men have been in military service, in effect, from the age of 7 to the age of 60, if they had to work in the fields or carry out other pursuits? So the helots made Spartan life possible. Now, of course, the Spartans' idea was that this gave them the freedom to ward off attack, to ward off invasion, to keep foes at bay. By about 550, the Spartans had pulled most of the cities of the Peloponnesus, southern Greece, southernmost Greece, together into the Peloponnesian League. Now, this was not kind of a Spartan version of the United Nations. The members of the Peloponnesian League were under absolutely no circumstances Sparta's equals. Sparta basically dictated to the Peloponnesian League what its plans would be, what its policies would be. Essentially, Sparta exercised some control over the constitutions of member states. The Spartans did not want democratic regimes. They thought they were too unstable, too tumultuous, and they wanted to control the foreign policy of the states of the Peloponnesian League. They didn't want any military adventurism amongst their neighbors that might have implications for themselves. The Spartan system was still fundamentally in place when the Romans conquered Greece in the 2nd century BC. By then, alas, there was a relative handful of equals left. Contemporaries, interestingly enough, had a tendency to admire Sparta. They admired its strength. They admired its simplicity. They admired its stability. Now, there is for us an interesting puzzle and an interesting challenge in that admiration that was accorded to Sparta, and it's just this. Most people, I think, would like to live in stable political systems. And then many people have been tempted toward authoritarian kinds of regimes that seem to them to promise stability, even if such regimes reduce dramatically the rights of individuals. There is a tug, there is a pull, there is something that demands from us a kind of a grudging admiration for systems like the Spartan. And in antiquity, the Spartan system was much admired. No one, I think, would say that the Athenian system was stable. Curiously, it was also not as much admired in antiquity as it would be subsequently. So having gotten some understanding of Sparta, we'll turn in our next lecture to the most famous, and in many ways the most interesting, of the Greek polis, Athens.